I've got to do one tomorrow for somebody I've never heard of.
I don't want to see you like on every other podcast either. You're our guy. Okay.
I've got to do one tomorrow for somebody I've never heard of. But he said to me, he's a nice guy. He sent me a note. He said, I love listening to you guys on Real Kipper. Can you do my podcast? So I'm doing his podcast tomorrow morning. I think it's a goaltending podcast, which I'll be really good at. You know?
Doug, thank you so much for doing this. I'm a massive fan. Watch you on Real Kipper and Born all the time. I saw you yesterday. You were awesome. So I really appreciate you coming on. It's a big deal for me. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No problem at all. That's part of the deal. You gotta, I have to sell books.
You can plug away all you want here. No problem. No problem. So I wanted to start off, Doug, just I guess not many people can say that you're a president, general manager, and head coach. So how would you describe your journey in hockey?
It was a pretty weird journey, to be quite honest. I played hockey up to the major junior level, and I went to St. Louis Blues training camp as a kid and as a player, and played college hockey in Canada. And then I became a high school teacher, mainly a special ed high school teacher. And I taught high school for 7 years in Summerside, PEI. And then I decided to go back to University of Western Ontario and get a master's in educational psychology, which would enhance my job as a teacher. And when I was going to London, I wrote a letter to Don Boyd, who was the general manager and coach of the London Knights, and said, hey, I've been coaching junior in the Maritimes, and, we just won a championship. I'd love to have a chance to be a volunteer assistant coach. So he said, hey, you come to training camp, and if I like you and you like me, you can be a volunteer assistant. So the year I did my master's, I worked with the Knights, and it was an unbelievably great experience with Don Boyd. And then Don, at the end of it, I decided not to go back to teaching, but I ended up applying for the University of New Brunswick head coaching job, and I got the job. And Don Boyd was a major part of that, his recommendation. So I ended up going to UNB, and I was there for a year, and out of the blue, Jacques Martin, who I had worked with at numerous hockey schools over the years in Ontario, and we had been friends and acquaintances, and he got this St. Louis Blues head coaching job. And after 1 year at UNB, I got hired as the St. Louis Blues assistant. And then 24 years later, I became a TV guy. So I was 24 years in the NHL as assistant coach in St. Louis, assistant coach in Washington, associate head coach in Detroit, assistant GM in Detroit. I was with the Washington Capitals as an assistant coach for a while. So, it was a long career. Then finally, I got the head coaching job at the Panthers. And then we had a great run there. And then I ended up getting the president GM job in Columbus. So it was a strange journey, but it was fun. I had a great experience. And then I left Columbus, and then I worked at Sportsnet for a number of years, and that's where I really finished my career. So it's been fun. And I retired at 65 when there was major cutbacks at Sportsnet. And so I left, and I've been really just pretty well taking it easy. Busy for some reason. Kiprio seems to keep me busy every Friday. And doing numerous podcasts. I wrote a book called Draft Day that came out 3 years ago, and I'd never written anything in my life, and I wrote the book, and it became a national bestseller. And I just finished a new book that's coming out in October. That's the life of an NHL general manager, and actually it's so that's been sort of the whole my spiel. The actual name of the book is called Game Day, The Uncensored Life of an NHL GM. And I did it with Greg Oliver, who did numerous books. So that comes out in October, first Tuesday of October. So we're really excited. Simon & Schuster excited. We're excited about it. So hopefully it'll turn out like Draft Day.
Yeah, that's amazing. I always watch Hockey Central at noon, Doug, with you and Nick Gross and Darren Millard. I remember, I think I was in high school, but I remember wanting to go home and catching it at 12 o'clock. every day. It was, I think they should bring it back. It was such a great show.
Yeah, it was a great time. Working with Darren and Nick was a treat. It wasn't like a job, and it became a really a popular show, and it became a popular show for NHL coaches, for GMs, for players. I remember hearing about the Penguins. Sid, every time he wanted to get off the ice so he could go and watch Hockey Central at noon. I remember Colby Armstrong telling me that. So it was a popular show. We had a great run, and obviously disappointed that it ended. But both Darren went on to Vegas and Nick has done well. So it really has been it was a great gig and lots of fun. And it really, it was amazing. Like, I would get calls from GMs and coaches talking about how much they enjoyed it because it was real. It was about real things that were going on in the league. And Nick had a great player's perspective. I had a great management perspective. And Darren was terrific at getting people engaged in good conversation. So it was a good team. We had a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was such a great show. I loved it as a fan. It was awesome. For your career, so did you ever think of going into the management side when you started in coaching?
No, not really. And look, I remember as an assistant coach in St. Louis, I was thrilled to be in the NHL, and I felt really lucky. I went from coaching junior in PEI to 3 years later being in the NHL, which is pretty fluky. And I was I think I was 31 when I got the job in St. Louis, and all I was trying to do was survive as an assistant coach, to be quite honest. We had Brian Sutter, Bernie Federico, Doug Gilmore. it was a great group in St. Louis. Greg Millen was our goaltender. Rick Walmsley was our goaltender, guys that I have had lifelong relationships with. Greg Millen was actually passed away recently, just devastating. He's my son's godfather, and Walmer became my goalie coach in Columbus for 10 years. So, it was a great experience and really trying to survive. And then funny what happened when Jock and I got fired in St. Louis, I got a call from Brian Murray, and Brian Murray was the coach in Washington. And when I was playing junior in Ontario as a kid, Brian was the coach of Pembroke, and I played against him and ended up in an all-star game with Brian as a coach. And we sort of forged a relationship because at the end of the year, Brian recommended me for a Hockey Canada scholarship, which was a full ride at any university in Canada to play hockey. And I'm thinking, wow, Brian Murray did that as an opposing coach. And so I met Brian when I got the UNB job. I met him, at the draft, and we sort of touched base every time I'd see him. I remember when he was in Charlottetown coaching the Centennial Cup with Rockland, I went up and introduced myself. And so we sort of forged a relationship over the years. And out of the blue, after I got fired, he phoned and offered me a job in Washington with the Caps as an assistant coach. And that really, Jacques Martin gave me my first chance. Don Boyd gave me a great opportunity, but Brian Murray really made my career, if the truth was known. I was with him in Washington. Then I followed him to Detroit. I had a chance to go to Philly as an assistant coach or head of the farm team in Hershey after I was in Washington and Baltimore. But I ended up going with Brian to Detroit as associate head coach, and then I became assistant GM, and that really was my first chance. But then I went back to coaching with the Panthers. So, and then when that fell apart, I got the Columbus job, and then I was in Columbus 11 years. So really a weird career, but I got a lot of breaks by a lot of really good people, and they sort of helped me along the way, to say the least.
Brian Murray was a legend.
Brian Murray's a legend. I tell you, I wrote the book, about the day in the life of an NHL general manager, and I really wanted to dedicate it to Brian Murray, but I didn't want to write a flowery description of Brian because he would have hated that. So all I put on the inside cover of the book is for Brian Murray. That's all I wrote, because that's what Brian was like. He was just a basic good person, and had an unbelievable hockey career. He was a school teacher. We both sort of had the same background. He became a high school teacher and a college teacher and became a coach. So just an amazing career and a good person.
Wow. He was something special. I remember with him in Ottawa, just like all those great teams. Doug, what do you think the biggest jump was from player to coach to executive, like in your experience?
You know what? I think the biggest challenge was going into the NHL as a really nobody, from a coach in PEI to an assistant in London to a head coach for 1 year at UNB to go into the NHL. It was really a tough jump. And I remember players telling me, and I used to take pride in this, that they used to say that I reminded them as an assistant coach of a former player type of assistant, not as a college guy, And I always sort of felt good about that a player would say, hey, you remind me more of a former player assistant coach than you do, a college guy. So I was proud of my background in teaching in college, but it was always good that you were sort of accepted in the NHL. It was a tough grind. I'll never forget the first day I walked into St. Louis and Bernie Federko and Brian Sutter, who were like, I think 3 years younger than me, said, hey, nice to meet you, Mr. MacLean. I thought, oh my God, what am I getting myself into here? So anyway, but you still, I have relationships from that group that were in St. Louis the very first year. Dougie Gilmore and I run into Dougie a lot and we have great chats, and I run into all kinds of guys from that team that, and every team I was involved with. So, it's been a fun, look, 24 years in the NHL as a guy coming from PEI and never playing in the NHL. I feel pretty fortunate that, how it happened. And people ask me all the time, how do you get into hockey? How do you get into the NHL? How do you become a scout? How do you become a assistant coach? How do you get your foot in the door? And there's no magical way. You just grind away at what you're doing, and you try to meet as many people as you can, and do the work, and be in rinks where you get an opportunity to meet people. So anyway, I've been lucky.
It's funny how you said, Doug, to do the work, because that's all I've been doing for the past 8 months at the rink, coaching goalies. So I go from rink to rink just at practice. So I definitely agree with you.
And that's important. That's just the way. And, how it works is you don't know if one of these goalies you're working with becomes an NHL star. You don't know if one of these goalies become a coach or a man. You just don't know how you get a break. And, I just think it's really important if you love doing it. I remember when I was 29, I was coaching in Summerside Junior, and I remember seeing a guy get a head job in the American Hockey League who was my age. His name was Earl Jessamine. And I remember saying to my wife, geez, it looks like I'll never get a chance to get out of Summerside, and, I'll be a junior coach in Summerside till I quit. I see this guy, 29, same age as me, getting a job coaching the Fredericton Express. And 2 years later, I'm in the NHL and he's in the American League. So it's weird, It's just weird, Yeah. So anyway, happens.
One of the reasons why I want to talk to you, Doug, is because I've been trying to get someone who has like NHL experience at the executive level. And since you're president and general manager, I think a lot of people my age, if you recall, like at NHL, like, I don't know, 26, and people are playing like GM mode, for example, and they're pretending to be a GM, right? But I want to ask you, like, what do fans don't realize about being a GM? Because it seems like a very difficult job.
It is when I sat down to write Game Day and to talk about the life of an NHL GM, and I interviewed probably 40 guys that were former presidents, former GMs, current day GMs, all presidents, all different aspects. And I looked at the job, and it really hit me how all encompassing this job is. It's unbelievable what a general manager of an NHL team is involved with and in charge of, because you're the final decision maker on the hockey side. And there's no more of a high and no more pressure than making a deal and consummating that deal by saying, yes, I agree, we're going to make this trade, or, and affecting people's lives in a positive way, in a negative way. But this being the ultimate decision maker in the organization is a lot. And there's so much from overseeing coaching, from overseeing the farm team, from overseeing, the big team, from overseeing scouting, from overseeing the training staff, the strength staff, dealing with trades, dealing with the draft, dealing with arbitration, dealing with every aspect of the job. It's really, dealing with the analytics department, dealing with so many different aspects of the game. It's really overwhelming. Like, it starts in the morning where I'd go into my office at whatever time it was. The first thing I would do was read on my computer. Every scout had to send a report, whether they were all over the world, Europe, US, Canada, wherever. The reports would come into my computer on RinkNet, which is, was an unbelievable breakthrough. And I'd read the scouting reports from the night before. There might be 2, there might be 6, there might be 8, but I just wanted to read the scouts' reports so that I could keep up with the players and have an idea who they were talking about, because GMs don't really get out and scout very much. You go out every once in a while, you'll meet your pro scout and go on the road with them for 4 or 5 days and look at top prospects and go to the prospects game and go to the Memorial Cup and go to the World Junior and go to the World Championship. So that's your scouting. You're not in the field. So I always wanted to keep up with the players that they were talking about. So that's the job, plus dealing with the players, dealing with the coaches. All those things, are on the GM's plate, and it's all encompassing. And that is before you have to deal with the fans and the media and the owners. So it really, when I sat down to write this book, it was unbelievable when I kept thinking, man, and dealing with agents and dealing with referees and dealing with the league office. Everything a GM has to deal with is all encompassing. It's unbelievable when you really, and I was sort of blown away when I was doing game day of the fact that, man, oh man, there's a lot on these guys' plates, and there's a ton of pressure. Right. Anyway. But it's fun. It's fun.
Yeah. Well, I remember trade deadline, Doug. Before, there used to be so many deals on deadline day. But in instance for this year, I think there was like 10 or so. Yeah. So how was trade deadline day for you?
Well, trade deadline day, draft day, trade deadline day, those are the biggest, training camp. Those are the biggest times of the most fun part of the job. Draft day, you're there, you're with your scouts, you're making big decisions. Not so much me, but my staff were making big decisions as who to pick. You leave the drafts on such a high that you think you've got a number of good young prospects. Trade deadline is a high because you're making deals to try to improve your team. Playoffs is always an important time, when you have a chance to win. I was lucky to go to the finals as a coach, not so lucky with an expansion team. But look, the highlight probably of my career was starting a franchise from scratch. I remember walking into Columbus, and I was the first hire, essentially, and there was a notepad on the desk, and that was it. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what have I got myself into? We hired 250 people eventually. We built the building, we built the practice facility. I mean, I was working for an amazing family, the McConnell family. It's mind-numbing when I think of what went into the job and what, I talked to Tommy Fitz in Jersey. He was a big part of the book, and George McPhee and Doug Armstrong and all these guys. And the job hasn't changed. It's just become more pressure-packed, and you got to win. That's the bottom line. We just saw what happened to Brad living in Toronto. I mean, that's one of the best jobs you could ever get. And, it fell apart. And that's life in the NHL. So it's an all-encompassing, overwhelming, but a great job.
If I can ask you about Columbus, Doug, because if you compare the expansion rules to Vegas and then your time in Columbus, I think there's a night and day, to be fair, of the rules. I guess my question is, how hard was it?
It was a joke, if the truth was known. My owners paid $80 million for the team, and Atlanta had come in the league. I should say Nashville come in the league. Then Atlanta come in the league by themselves. Then us and Minnesota come in together. And that really complicated it. The player pool had been picked over by Atlanta and Nashville. And then we come in as two teams picking against each other. The rules were the same as they were when Nashville and Atlanta come in. And really, it was a joke. I mean, it really was. Most guys tried to get through the expansion draft, getting a few players, but your main goal was to get through without contracts, sign free agents and so on. So it was really complicated. Doug Reiser and myself going head to head against each other and how it turned out. And then I know Gary Bettman for a fact said to the Board of Governors that when Vegas come in, we're charging Vegas $500 million for this team. We've got to change the rules. And when Vegas came in, the rules were dramatically different and the player pool was dramatically different. And they had to be, and they should have been. And it was a good move by Gary to do that. And they had to do it because, it was really hard to become competitive. Minnesota did a good job. I thought we did. We finished our first year in Columbus ahead of Minnesota and ahead of 5 or 6. I mean, our second draft, we were picking 8th in the draft. Like, how dumb were we? How dumb was I? And, so I think, Doug Reiser did a great job in Minnesota. We became competitive, but it was really, really tough, really tough. And the NHL, then Seattle comes in and they pay more money and they get a good deal and they're coming in by themselves. So expansion drafts have dramatically changed and they should have changed. And, I never would have complained about the expansion draft because we just felt lucky that we were we were there. So you certainly never complained about it. And it was a great challenge and it was fun. But I think that's the one regret of my career. I was a head coach of an expansion team in Florida. And I was a head coach or a GM of an expansion team and never really got a chance to be a GM of a established team. And that's sort of the one regret I might have, but that's the way it is.
I feel like you were the first in SI, right? So that's a huge accomplishment as well.
We moved to Columbus, Ohio, and there was 700 kids playing minor hockey in Columbus, which is actually a pretty big city. It was 1.5 million people in those days, and it caught me off guard how big a city it was. Ohio State was there, which was a huge part of the city. Today, there's 8,000 kids playing minor hockey, and there's rinks, and the Blue Jackets, we started the AAA program there. My son was playing AAA at the time, and he had to drive to Dayton to play AAA hockey. So we started the Junior Blue Jacket program, which they've done an unbelievable job of developing youth hockey, and the Blue Jackets have been a big part of that. So, it's become a hockey town, and numerous Junior Blue Jackets have become NHL players. And I remember Sean Corrali and Gord Murphy's son, who just got traded to Edmonton, as Adam players, in Columbus, and 8-year-olds playing, and now they're NHLers. And there's numerous kids in the NHL from Columbus. They've done an unbelievable job. They really have.
Rick Nash too, Doug. Rick Nash, like what a player.
Yeah, Rick Nash was a thrill to be able to draft him in 2002 with the draft in Toronto. We had the 3rd pick, and we were able to move up and get the 1st pick, and to be able to step up to the podium in Toronto and announce a Toronto kid as our 1st pick was pretty cool. And Rick, as a matter of fact, I just talked to him. I had a note from him a few weeks ago. He said he was listening to me on Kipper's show, and he said he was chuckling. So he sent me a note. We were laughing, but he's assistant GM now in Columbus. He's a legend there. I went in for his jersey retirement. He's always been just a fabulous, fabulous guy and great ambassador. I think the world of him.
So cool. Can I ask you, Doug, about building a winner since we're talking about the NHL? Because in your experience or like your insight, like what building a team, like what should GMs be doing?
Yeah, look, it's a tough situation, and every situation is different. And in Florida, when we built the team, Brian Murray built the team with Bill Torrey, and I was the coach after Roger Nielsen had been the coach and really set a great foundation. They did an amazing job of building an expansion team into a 3rd year in the league. We went to the Stanley Cup Finals, and it was unbelievable character on that hockey team. The culture that was set by Roger Nielsen, by Brian Murray, by Bill Torrey was, character players. They had good speed. Their expansion draft was a little easier. They ended up getting Van Beesbrook, who became a legend and a superstar in Florida. But they had Scott Mellenby and Brian Scrudlin and Dave Lowry and Billy Lindsay, and you go on and on and on, and you think, okay, this was one of the most character teams. Stewie Barnes was on that team. one of the most character teams you could ever be around. And they did an amazing job. Bobby Clark was also involved early on in the franchise. And they built a character group that played fast, that played quick. And to think about that team, that 95, 96 Panther team, I look at every player that was on that team, and almost to a man, they've done really well in life. And it tells you right there about the character of the group. Some of them have become coaches, some have become management. Guys have done well in their careers out of hockey. So it was an amazing group to coach, and they played hard, and they were gritty, and they were mean. And I mean, it was never say die with the group, and it's pretty amazing, really.
What does that look like, Doug, in the locker room?
What's that look?
Having a good culture. Yeah.
That group, they were us against the world mentality, and John Van Beesbroek backstopped it, but it was a dressing room that, and it's really important. It was a belief in there that we could beat anybody. And, I hear people talk about, we got to get the right culture. We got to get this, we got to get that. Culture starts with having a team that's good enough. Toronto's believe they have a culture problem, but their biggest problem is they're not good enough. And they've got to get better players. They've got to, we lucked out there. We ended up with Eddie Jovanovski as a first overall pick and became a tough defenseman. We had Gordon Murphy in the back end, who was a great defenseman. I mean, we had a group of veterans there with kids. Rhett Warner was a solid guy, but we were a pretty good team, and so I think the culture happens when you have a better team and they bond together, and it's not easy, but that belief that you can win is pretty important, and have a good goaltender. When Toronto, 2 years ago, Toronto were a top team in the NHL, and Stolars and Wall stood on their head. This year, their goaltending was subpar, tough injuries, losing Marner. There's they're not the same team. And now they've got to rebuild that and retool it. So it'll be fun to watch with the type of players they brought in. I've never seen a team that brought in so many players in the last summer, and not one of them really turned out with the expectations you thought. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Now, Tanev, in fairness, Tanev was injured, and he's one guy that really played above expectations when he was healthy. So it's a monumental, challenging job. And that's what the new guy is going to be faced with. It's going to be a tough job. So we'll see.
Do you think, Doug, because there's that definition of retool and rebuild? For me, it's the same. Now, I don't think there's much of a difference, but what are your thoughts on it?
Well, rebuild is when you really, clean house and you get as many draft picks as you can and start to build through the draft. Stanley Cup winner, when I wrote Draft Day, the previous, from 1999 to, 2022, every NHL Stanley Cup winner had at least 10 draft picks of their own on the team. That was the model. You get your 10 draft picks and you build around that. And it takes you a while to accumulate those draft picks. But it was Tampa Bay, Colorado, all the Stanley Cup winners, whether it was St. Louis Blues or any of them that were recent Stanley Cup winners, had at least 10 draft picks on their team. Today, that's not the case. The model has changed now because you saw what Vegas have done. You saw what the Florida Panthers have done. They've changed the model. And the model now is 3 or 4 draft picks, 4 or 5 free agents, 4 or 5 trades, pick up a guy on waivers. The building of a team now is become multidimensional. The draft is still really important. I mean, think about the Florida Panthers. Barkov is still the horse. He's still the horse as a 3rd overall pick. He's their driver. But then you had Tkachuk in a trade. You had Bennett in a trade. You pick up Forsling on waiver. You trade for Jones. So and then you have your 3 or 4 draft picks in Ekblad and some good kids. So it's multidimensional now to build a team, and it's changed, to be quite honest. And I think it gives more people an opportunity to build Stanley Cup winners. If you look at the Panther model and you look at the Vegas model, and even Colorado now are building, and they still have good draft picks there because Nathan McKinnon's always going to be a great pick, and Landeskog and so and so. But it's become, as I said, different ways to build a team now.
I remember because you mentioned Toronto, Doug, and I watched the press conference with the new CEO, and he was saying we have foundational pieces. And I guess the question is whether they're going to keep those foundational pieces or not, like Matthews and Nylander. I think that was my big question when I was watching it, because then that would go into a rebuild, right? If they do trade him.
Yeah, it's going to be a real interesting situation when the new GM comes in, and I'm always intrigued by, and I said this yesterday on Nick's show, is what is the plan of the new GM going to be? And Keith Pelly's a sharp guy, solid guy, who's ever interviewing has got to present an unbelievable plan as to how we're going to turn this team back into a contender. They went through a 10-year rebuild there when they drafted Marner, Matthews. Now these guys have played 10 years in the league. Nylander, Matthews. The big thing for me is what is Matthews? What is going on with Austin Matthews? We know he's a superstar. We know he's a 60-goal scorer. We know he's been banged up. So can Matthews come back to be? Critical element of this team's rebuild or retool. Can he regain what he was? Is it because, let's not kid ourselves. He and Marner were unbelievable chemistry together. And Marner helped Matthews. Matthews helped Marner. So what does it take to get Matthews back? We know Nylander's a good player. Can he get over the hump and be a winner, So there's a lot of, the big challenge to me with the new group is pretty solid goaltending, reasonable depth players. The superstars are there. They've got to surround them with better players, and their goaltending's got to come to a whole nother level. Is there 8 or 10 guys there that should be back? Yeah. And then you fill in around there through free agents, trades, or whatever you have to do. So it's going to be a fun dynamic to watch, and it's going to be a tough job, but there's not anybody in the hockey world that wouldn't want that job and have that.
Yeah. I remember when Brian Burke got hired there, he says, center of the hockey universe. And it is.
Yeah. That's right.
One last question, Doug, on the Leafs, if that's okay. For Matthews, do you think it is a system problem with Berube's system? Is that why he's taking a step back? Or do you think it's more of the injuries?
I don't think it's Berube's system. I think Craig is a solid guy. Was he the right fit with this group? Let's not forget that they wanted to change the DNA of the team. That's not easy to do. You bring in, it's okay. You bring in new players, but I've never seen a group of guys that were brought in, 6, 8, 10 guys, and not one of them had a better year than you expect. Every one of them was just okay. None of them took it to another level. I think Craig got caught a little bit, caught with, what the expectations were of the style of game they were going to play. It's hard to tell Matthews and Marner and Nylander that they've got to play a aggressive, type of game. They want to play a flow game. They don't want to play that way. And losing Marner, I still maintain this. Losing Marner was a devastating loss. And the next group are going to be faced with what becomes of Matthews. He's got 2 years left. He and Connor McDavid are both going to be unrestricted free agents in 2 years' time. And, if the Leafs can't re-sign him. So it's a pivotal time for the Toronto Maple Leafs organization. And that's why, the president or whatever he is, Keith, CEO, is saying this is probably the biggest hire. Keith Pelly has hired a ton of people in his sports broadcasting career. And this, he's saying, maybe his most important hire in his career. And it is, maybe. It is. It's an important hire. And it'll be interesting to see who gets the job and what direction they go, what type of person they hire. It'll be fun to watch.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to ask you, Doug, 2 more questions about coaching and then quick hits at the end. But how does coaching style, has that evolved over time?
It's evolved, but I look at how John Cooper coaches, who's supposed to be the greatest coach in the history of the game, and I look at how Scotty Bowman coached, and I look at how Joel Quenneville coached, and all the guys that have had great success. And I don't know that it's that different. I'm not convinced it's that different from Scotty Bowman to Quenneville to Cooper to all the top, supposedly top coaches. To Paul Maurice was the losingest coach in NHL history till he got to Florida. Now he's a genius, So personnel play a big part of that. He's done a good job. I don't know. Look, there's more frills that go with the job. You've got the more video work. You got more analytics involved. And so the job has, changed. No doubt it's evolved, but it's still the one-on-one relationships and the presentation to your group and how you motivate. There's still that element that has not changed, in my opinion. And players are different. I'll give them that, but they're not really that different. I mean, I'm thinking, when I was coached with Steve Yzerman, and I was a coach with Doug Ilmore, and I was a coach with Sergei Fedorov, and I was a coach with Dino Cicero. I mean, stars, and I don't know that it's changed. The players, I guess, everybody says they've changed, but I don't know. They still want to win. They want to play. They want to survive in the NHL. So I don't know. There's a big difference, to be quite honest.
Is there a difference, Doug, between, I guess, coaching the stars and then the rest of the roster?
Yeah, there's no doubt it's different. You coach stars a little differently, but the stars still have the challenges. The stars have more challenges than the average player because they have expectations that are through the roof and a ton of pressure on them. So yeah, you coach them differently. And, the bottom line is with every player, you try to help them be better. And if they don't believe you're helping them get better, your life as a coach becomes short. That's the bottom line. There's respect there if they think you're helping them get better.
I remember watching you, Doug, on Real Kip on Board, and you said how you love the way the game is going. So I wanted to ask you more about in depth about that too. Like, what is it about the game that you're really excited about?
I think the skill level is better than it's ever been. I think the speed of the game is the best it's ever been. I still think the physical element is coming back to the game, and we see it, especially now that we're in the stretch drive, the way teams are playing. I just think it's in good shape. There's some subtleties there, ending games with shootouts. I was in the Board of Governors meeting when we put those rules in, 3-on-3 shootouts. And I remember thinking, what are we doing here? But it's gone from a clutch and grab style game to a free flow game. Still got physicalness. I think it's in a good place. I really do think it's a good place. Bettman is the salary cap has been a challenge. It drives me crazy that every article basically and every hockey discussion is around the cap. And I don't like that per se, but it's added that teams are unbelievably competitive. I mean, the parity is unbelievable, and that was part of it. And Bettman deserves credit for getting the cap in there because it saved the game. The league was losing $175 million a year before the cap came in. So he's done a great job in that area for me. And the game, I think it's in a pretty good place. I really do. I mean, you can have all the bitches you want about it, but it's still in a pretty good place.
Yeah. And the first round too, Doug, how Gary Bettman said recently that the first round matchup in the playoffs is probably the best entertainment you'll find. And he's probably right because they're all the rivals.
Yeah. I mean, I love the first round of the playoffs because it's great teams. It's this 2-3 setup drives me crazy because you lose a good team in the first round. But still, those are the rules. Everybody knows it. And, you're going to have Minnesota and Dallas meet in the first round. One of those two teams that both are Stanley Cup contenders are going to be. Well, last year it happened, Colorado and Dallas in the first round. One of the two, Colorado's out. Maybe the best team in the NHL, So there's but overall it's in a really good place.
Amazing. I don't want to take too much more of your time, Doug. So we play a final segment here on the Behind the Glass podcast of Quick Hits. So it's basically 5 questions, whatever comes top of mind, usually 1 or 2 word answers, and we'll go from there. So the first one is, hardest player to manage.
Hardest player to manage. Stevie Y would have been the hardest. Because he was a driven 27-year-old with a ton of pressure and, leader of the team. And he was upset. And the team, he didn't have enough success. Stevie Y was in his 14th year in the NHL when he finally won a cup. And he tried to do it a lot himself. He was a 50-goal scorer, but he became a consummate team guy. And the team around him got better, but he was challenging because he was so obsessed with being a star. and a good guy.
My dad's favorite player is Steve Yzerman. That's so cool. Next one, most underrated position in hockey.
Most underrated position in hockey. I guess I would have to say being a defenseman is by far the most underrated position, because your defending has become such an important part of hockey, whether you're a forward or defenseman. But to think about the talent that the forward group in the NHL have and the speed they play with, and you have to defend against them. 1-on-1, 2-on-1s, 3-on-1s. I think the positioning in the defensive zone, the positioning, the box outs in front of the net, and the most critical element of being a defenseman is the ability to move the puck out of your own zone. So to me, that's by far the toughest position.
Amazing. Cup or individual awards? What matters more?
Yeah, it's not even close. I mean, the cup is what it's all about.
Yeah.
Every player that wins the Stanley Cup, to see them win it and to think about what they've gone through from the time they were 6 years of age till the time they carry the Stanley Cup off the ice. I was close in the finals, but to see a player win a cup and what it means to them, I just think it's an unbelievable thing, because what these guys have gone through since they were 6 years of age. That's all they think about is winning the cup.
Right.
It's not even close.
Last one, Doug. Final message to players and fans chasing the dream.
Fans and players chasing the dream. I think, realize as a player, realize how lucky you are to be able to play in the NHL and to have a career in the NHL. Less than 1% of people that play hockey get an opportunity to go to that level. And the fans just love the game and realize that winning is really hard, and winning the cup is really hard. And I remember going through a 7-week Stanley Cup run as a coach, and we didn't have one player on that team that wasn't physically beat up and played through whatever they had to play through to survive. So remember that every player in the Stanley Cup playoffs and finals and Stanley Cup, they're all beat up. It's a 7-week grueling grind.
Doug, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I was a massive fan before, even more of a fan now. Thank you to Jack Armstrong for making this happen. This was really cool. So thank you so much for coming on. And I guess one last time, promote your books. Where can people find them?
Well, Draft Day's in pretty well every bookstore and on Amazon, and A Day in the Life of a General Manager is coming out coming out the first Tuesday of October. So Simon & Schuster will have it everywhere. So looking forward to it, but I'm retiring as an author. Okay, man. Thanks for having me, man. Good luck.
A big thank you to Doug MacLean for joining the show and sharing his insights. If you enjoyed the conversation, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with your friends. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next episode.